You think you domesticated wheat. You planted it, harvested it, milled it, baked it, ate it. You were in charge. Well, what if I told you that wheat was running the whole operation, and you were just the labor? Case open. For most of human history, your ancestors spent their days doing something remarkable, almost nothing. Hunt a little, gather some berries, sleep under a tree. The average hunter-gatherer worked maybe 4 hours a day to feed themselves. 4 hours! Then they had the rest of the day for rest, socializing, doing whatever early humans did for fun. And then, about 12,000 years ago, someone made what looked like the deal of the century. They settled down. They planted wheat. And almost immediately, life got harder. Here is the part that most people never stop to ask. Why did they do it? Why would anyone voluntarily trade 4 hours of work per day for 12? Why give up freedom and variety for a single crop that, if it failed, meant everyone die? Historians used to say it was because farming was obviously better. More food, more stability, the beginning of civilization. But that story has a serious problem. The bones disagree. When scientists started analyzing the skeletal remains of early farmers versus the hunter-gatherers who came just before them, they found something disturbing. The farmers were shorter. They had more infections, more dental cavities, more signs of chronic malnutrition. The variety was gone. Instead of dozens of different plants and animals, they were eating mostly one thing, and they were working themselves to death to do it. So the question is not just why did they switch? The real question is, once they saw how hard it was, why did they not stop? This is where the investigation gets interesting, because the answer might not be about human choice at all. Let's set the scene. 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, small bands of humans were doing what they had always done, moving with the seasons, following animals, picking wild grasses, including the wild ancestors of wheat. And here is the thing about wild wheat, it is almost useless. The seeds fall off the stalk the moment they are ripe. You cannot harvest it efficiently. You cannot store it. It is basically designed to scatter itself across the ground and grow on its own terms, not yours. But occasionally, a mutation happened. A wheat plant would be born with a tougher connection between the seed and the stalk, what botanists call a non-shattering rachise. That plant could not spread its own seeds. It was, technically, a failure from wheat's perspective. It would have died out in a generation, except that one human walked by, noticed the seeds were still attached, and thought, I can actually harvest this. So they did. They brought it back to camp. Some seeds fell on disturbed soil near the camp. Those seeds grew. The human came back, and without making any conscious decision to farm, without any grand plan, they had just become wheat's delivery system. That non-shattering mutation, the one that made wheat dependent on humans to reproduce, that was the moment the trap closed. But neither side knew it yet. Here is the first clue. Wild wheat cannot spread its seeds without wind or animals knocking them loose. The mutant wheat, the kind that actually became the crop we know today, physically cannot reproduce without a human hand to harvest it, carry it, and drop some on fresh soil. From a pure survival standpoint, this plant went from scattered and independent to completely dependent on one species. That sounds like a loss, but look at what it got in return. Before the partnership, wild wheat occupied maybe a few thousand square kilometers in the Middle East. That's competitive, vulnerable to drought. Today, wheat grows on 220 million hectares of land. That is roughly the size of Greenland, planted wall to wall with a single species. It is one of the 3 most successful plants in the history of this planet, by biomass, by range, by total number of individual plants alive right now. From wheat's perspective, if we can call it that, this was the greatest expansion in the history of grasses, and all it cost was letting humans think they were in charge. But here is what did not add up. Humans were not stupid. They could see the work was brutal, so something else must have been holding them there. And this is where the second clue breaks the whole story open. Once you start farming, you cannot just stop. This is the trap, and it is mechanical, not psychological. The first season you plant wheat, you eat wheat. You start depending on it. Your population grows a little, because the calories are there even if the nutrition is poor. More mouths mean you need more wheat next season. So you plant more, which means you are even more locked in. You cannot go back to hunting and gathering. There are too many of you now, and the land around your settlement has already been cleared, the game driven off. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle requires low population density. Once you crossed that threshold, retreat was not an option. Economists have a name for this kind of situation, a population trap. You think it is about wheat, but the mechanism is the same as any modern subscription you cannot cancel because canceling costs more than staying. You are not choosing to continue. You are just unable to stop. And this is the moment where most history books change the subject and start talking about cities and writing and bronze. But I want to stay here for a second, because this is the part that has actual consequences for living, breathing humans, then and now. Consider what happened to the people caught inside this trap. The first farming communities show something that archaeologists find in site after site, continent after continent. Extreme inequality appears almost immediately. In hunter-gatherer bands, there is almost no meaningful wealth gap. You cannot own a herd of animals when you are moving. You cannot hoard grain when there is no grain to hoard. But the moment you have a surplus, even a small one, someone can own more of it than someone else. And once that is possible, it becomes likely. And once it's likely, it becomes permanent. In Çatalhöyük, one of the earliest farming settlements ever excavated, researchers found that within just a few generations of agriculture starting, some individuals were eating much better than others. Same village, same crop, radically different outcomes. The bones of the wealthy farmers were longer and healthier. The bones of the poor farmers looked worse than the hunter-gatherers who had come before either of them. This is not a medieval story. This is not an ancient Egypt story. This is 12,000 years ago, and the mechanism is identical to what you see in any modern economy where one resource becomes central and someone controls access to it. Wheat did not just change what people ate, it invented the conditions for poverty to exist at scale. And that is still not the most unsettling part. Here is the revelation. The thing that makes this case genuinely strange is not that humans chose wheat. It is that wheat chose us back, and the choice was irreversible on both sides. Every domesticated crop you can name went through the same negotiation. Corn started as a wild grass called teosint, with maybe a dozen kernels on a cob barely the size of your thumb. Its mutation toward larger, attached kernels made it useless in the wild and indispensable to humans. Rice, barley, sorghum, every single staple went through a version of this same mutation. And in every case, the plant gave up independence in exchange for global domination, and the human gave up freedom in exchange for calories. The biologist Richard Dawkins wrote about genes using organisms as survival machines. Wheat used humans as survival machines. The wheat that could not let go of its seeds was the wheat that survived. The humans who happened to be in the right place to harvest it were the humans whose population expanded. Neither one planned it. Neither one could opt out. The relationship just locked in, generation after generation, until 12,000 years later you have a species, us, that builds entire economies around a single mutant grass, fights wars over the land to grow it, subsidizes it with government money, and builds skyscrapers full of offices where people spend their lives managing the logistics of it. Right now, wheat accounts for about 20% of all the calories consumed by every human on Earth. Not 20% of some people's diets, 20% of the total calories eaten by 8 billion people. If wheat disappeared tomorrow, the global food system would collapse within months. We are not farming wheat. We are wheat's life support system. And here's the part that should make you sit with this for a second. The same logic applies to every system you think you are running. Your relationship with your phone, with coffee, with the algorithm that decides what you watch next. In every case, you adopted something because it offered short-term value. It restructured your behavior to serve its own continuation. Your life built up around it until opting out became more costly than staying, and now you maintain it. You call it a choice. The wheat farmers called it farming. Domestication is a two-way street, and the species that thinks it is doing the domesticating is not always the one holding the leash. So here is where we land. About 12,000 years ago, humans did not decide to farm wheat. A mutation happened. Humans responded to it, populations grew and locked in, and a feedback loop started that neither side could break. Wheat is now one of the most successful organisms on the planet. Humans are now completely dependent on it. The farmers who started it were shorter, sicker, and worked harder than their ancestors, and they could not stop because stopping would have meant death for everyone who had come to depend on the system. The first domesticators were not conquerors. They were the first people to discover what it feels like to be inside something that grew bigger than your ability to control it. Which, if you look around, sounds pretty familiar. Case closed. If this case changed how you see something you thought you understood, that is the whole point. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next case. The evidence is already waiting.